Yeah. So yeah,
How let's kind of orient here. So this is episode number 30 of the Rooster Crow podcast. I have a friend of mine, Telosbound. He has a YouTube channel titled Telosbound. Trey, thanks for being with me. This will be our second discussion.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
of
for
course.
having me.
Yeah, no, of course. I find your background and your frame of reference that you present on your YouTube channel fascinating, and I share it. And I don't see a lot of people that have engaged with fruitfully the intersection of psychoanalysis, the work of Slavoj Žižek or Hegel, with regards and in terms of Orthodox Christianity. So I think it's very interesting. And we're going to get into kind of a broad overview using the least amount of jargony terms that we can of understanding what is materialism, what is dialectical materialism of the 20th century, why that matters, and how we could potentially relate it to or put it in dialogue with some notions from patristic understandings of Orthodox theology. But before we get into that, I'd like to know what initially sparked your interest in philosophy. How old were you? How old are you now?
I'm 18 now.
You're 18. Okay. So what age were you? Because you're very young to be interested in these ideas, and your understanding of Hegel and Žižek usually take decades to, you have to kind of go through the history of philosophy, especially the work of Gilles Deleuze, right? To get to them, like these are like the final bosses of psychoanalysis and philosophy. So how old were you when you started getting into philosophy, and what did that look like?
I believe I was 12 when I first read Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil and Plato's The Republic, and that was basically the beginning of me getting into philosophy. But actually, I didn't really get into the philosophy I like now, like in terms of ontology, epistemology, philosophy of subjectivity. I didn't really get into that until about 2 years ago when I discovered Žižek. I was really mostly into political stuff for until I was about 15. And then I think that's when I discovered Žižek. And ever since then, I mean, even when it comes to like you mentioned Deleuze, I haven't read Deleuze really. Like I've read a bit of Difference and Repetition, and I've watched your videos on him, but that's basically the extent of my knowledge. Everything really that I like, I've read a decent amount of Hegel, but mostly in terms of Kant, Hegel, Lacan, all of these really important people, which I'm sure we're going to be discussing today. Basically my knowledge of them is always mediated through Žižek because I've read a lot of Žižek's works. I've read all of his really big important stuff, and that's basically my starting point when it comes to discussing any basically the philosophy of subjectivity, which is what I'm most interested in. Basically, I was introduced to it through Žižek, and I've basically formed my understanding of it around Žižek. And ever since I became an Orthodox Christian, I've started to try and, as you have, try and fit some of these Žižekian and Lacanian Hegelian concepts within a patristic framework. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about this and try and figure out, at least provide a sort of framework or ground starting point from how we can approach this question and try and figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's most people that are not familiar with Orthodoxy, they're going to see us talking about Christianity in terms of relating in response to these thinkers as absurd, or Christianity is not, it's too shallow, it doesn't have I think there's not a lot of understanding, and I think there's a stumbling block for thinkers to really engage with Orthodox patristic theology because of its Christian roots, right? Yeah. So I think trying to get people past that obstacle is something that I'm working on, and I'm glad that you are as well. It's interesting that I got into philosophy first and foremost through political philosophy, and that sparked my interest. And then I found philosophy there, and I was just started college when that happened. Have you read the philosopher, the political theologian Carl Schmitt?
Yeah, I've read some of his. What's it called? The Concept of the Political.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think just as an aside here, his understanding of the political as that which makes the distinction between friend and enemy. Mm-hmm. I think that's putting that in dialogue with the understanding of love your enemies as yourself, as a sort of solution to the problem of politics, the problem of, that Nietzsche inaugurated or identified, the will to power. There's actually a solution to that. I don't know if it's a political or broad solution, but at least on an individual basis, I think that's kind of where it's at. But let's back up just a little bit. What was going on in your life at 12 years old to find philosophy? Do you have friends? Did you have cousins? Did you have family members that were into it?
No, not really. But I believe I got the first book I read, Beyond Good and Evil, from my grandmother. So,
Why
yeah,
that book?
I think it's just because it may have actually been my mom's, which my grandma had from college. And yeah, and then I didn't understand it. I didn't understand the Republic at all. And I recently reread the Republic about 3 months ago, which really, it was a really great experience. And Nietzsche, actually, I guess I really came into philosophy through Nietzsche. And actually, Nietzsche was my guy before Žižek. It went from Nietzsche to Žižek. I've read all of Nietzsche's books. I own all of Nietzsche's books because they're so easy to find at bookstores or online for cheap.
Mhm.
And yeah, so and I know you've talked a lot about Nietzsche, and I haven't really thought too much about how Nietzsche would relate to orthodoxy. And I know there are other connections there, and I know we have to talk about how the Christianity he was talking about was distinct from orthodoxy. Um, but yeah, so I mean, I started with Nietzsche, and I guess I just found him interesting, and then I found the political stuff interesting, and the online debates, and this is the time, of course, Trump was president, and it was a more exciting time, I would say, and
Mhm.
more hopeful time for us. But yeah, and then as I said, found Žižek, and from there, basically, read him, got familiar with him. Then I just decided to start my channel, and uh, yeah, and then I was already Christian when I started my channel. I became Christian, I would say, late 2020. And essentially, this whole time, I've been trying to think about this question of subjectivity and how it relates to Christianity. And interestingly, I know that you did your video on Lacan, Žižek, and the philosophy of subjectivity. I don't know if you know which video I'm talking about that you made. You were talking about how trying to read it, basically exactly what I would say later, that the void is, we can connect it to the fall. That's right. You were trying to talk about how the fall is related to the Žižekian and Lacanian notions. And I discovered that, and it basically just confirmed my belief that there is something here. So I've
Mhm.
been, just trying to dig in deeper. And just very recently, actually, I made the connection to 666, which, with the help of my cousin and the stuff Jonathan Pageau has written about. And um, yeah, that was a big thing. So we decided to make that big video on it, and it's done really well, actually. But interestingly, I checked, they don't show the dislikes anymore, but I checked
Mhm.
the dislike ratio, and we a good 30% of 30% of the people who either liked or disliked. So it clearly struck a nerve, with some people. And hopefully that is more so a sort of cognitive dissonance over the fact that hopefully we did our job of showing that Orthodox Christianity at least deserves to be a contender, amongst as a possible explanation, because in modern um, discourse, everyone gets to have an opinion on stuff. Like, especially in terms of philosophy, you have Derridians, Nietzscheans, Hegelians, all these people. But in terms of a genuine Christianity, it's not even considered. It's just like, no, that's naive, whatever. And hopefully we
Mhm.
can, change that stereotype and false stereotype of our theology.
Yeah, I think people see that, people that are more kind of naive and understand 666 is some popular culture reference. It's like, oh yeah, there's this big bad devil. His number is 666, the mark of the beast. Okay, to get past that, I think it's important. And I think your cousin did an excellent job really encapsulating the narrative of 666, what it means, how it relates to the creation of the world, right? On the sixth day, God created man. So the kind of the idea that 666 is man's trying to build civilization and himself through his self-understanding. And it negates the seventh day, which is the day of rest, which is the Sabbath, which actually kind of inaugurates, or I would say that kind of points man appropriately towards the infinite. And once you close yourself off from the infinite, it's this self-enclosed system. And they attempt to make a totalizing self-enclosed system necessarily leads to disasters. But before we get into it, I want to just harken a little bit more on when you were 12 years old, what question were you looking to answer by looking into philosophy?
Honestly, I really don't know. I mean, I feel like it was just like, I'm not gonna, like, I should clarify that I wasn't like a avid reader at the time, that wouldn't come until I was about 15. In fact, it was like I read the basic, philosophy, like, Nietzsche, Plato, and like some others, and then immediately I just went into the political stuff and, debating people on Instagram, debating people in YouTube comments and stuff, barely reading, just like watching, videos, and sort of getting really deeply involved in political stuff, which I don't know if I regret, but I definitely don't want to, go back into that. But so yeah, there wasn't really a question, but I can see, looking back, it's clear that it was, God acting in my life. But
were you an atheist at that point?
Yeah, I was an atheist until my conversion. I didn't even think about Christianity, honestly, and that's what's so strange about my conversion. I hadn't read any of the church fathers when I decided to be Christian. It was it was purely an act of grace, I guess, that just made me see something that, and what's funny, which I kind of see as proof of this. I didn't, even when I was saying I was a Christian, I didn't really believe until probably 6 months later, when I discovered Cobain, Seraphim, I know he changed his name, Seraphim Hamilton, and his videos. Those are what really made I started to really believe. And then after that, I guess there were sort of experiences I had in my life that made me even more believe even more. So yeah, I was an atheist until late 2020, and then
were you a nihilist? Yeah. You'd say a nihilist?
Or no, I wouldn't say so. I wasn't like actually I was kind of a shallow person, I would say, in the sense that I had held all these views that, looking back, were nihilistic, in principle. Like, I didn't believe there was any purpose to life or anything after death, but I was very judgmental of people. Like, why are you depressed? Just, if you're depressed, like, how could you be depressed when you can go, do drugs, or go, do whatever you want? If you really don't care about life, just, have the most fun that you can have. So I didn't really understand even how someone could be nihilistic or depressed, because of how, shallow of a person I was at the time. But yeah.
I had a similar kind of situation when, I was Christian my whole life, but I fell away. I was Christian in name only, if that. I just wasn't an atheist. I wasn't really, a Christian, any kind of practicing. And I remember watching Jonathan Pageau's videos and his symbolic framework. I was like, what is this dude reading? What is going on here? This is right. Tremendous. And a lot of people would ask him that, and he would comment. He'd say, it's all there in the church fathers. And I would dismiss it. Okay, that's cool. What else? I'd be like, okay, what else? All the church fathers, St. Gregory Nyssa, this, that. I'm like, come on, he's holding back. There's something else. And it took a good while of engaging with his work to start looking at the church fathers. And then once I found them, I was like, whoa, it's all there. And I think something our collective project here is getting people to consider, to just take a look. Yeah. And it's not like trying to convert anybody. It's not my position at all, but especially those are philosophically and psychoanalytically inclined, that are intellectually inclined, kind of like you and I are. Take a look, just go and look, observe, and put the relationship in dialogue, put the concepts in dialogue. It's not about, converting or doing anything else. I think there's just a whole rich environment there to be mined that will bear fruits. And I think that's happening now. And as we get kind of into the main part of our discussion here, thanks for sharing that with me, your background there. I see that you started reading McGowan and his book on Hegel, and you had a great interview with McGowan, which I watched. And I think maybe we can start through his lens to get an understanding of what is materialism, what is Hegel's project, again, as best we can without using jargon. And then your thoughts on, just quickly on McGowan. Have you given him some of your orthodox critiques?
I haven't really. He knows I'm a Christian, but I haven't yet. I wouldn't say I know him well enough yet to really be doing that in the sense that he's actually a very well-respected person. He has a lot of I don't know. Yeah, like I'm planning on just having that come with time, developing. And I don't think I'm even in a position intellectually to be able to contend with someone like McGowan or someone like Žižek. So
I don't
really,
think it's contending. I think it's not contending. But you're very insightful, right? And you bring up great points that are not obvious, right? So it's not about, hey, this is my view, Todd. I think I'm right. Rebuke it.
Yeah,
it's
true.
just presenting this perspective that you've come upon, and let him engage with it, and then he can help you, or you can, what I'm saying, that dialogue is not about one or the other being right, but it's about finding you have an avenue towards someone like McGowan. So put those ideas and see what he thinks of them, maybe in dialogue or in an email or whatever it may be. I think it'd be interesting. And just in a weird aside, so I saw my good friend, virtual friend that I've had for a decade or so, on my Facebook, he posted your video talking to Don McGowan, and I'm like, what is this? Because he's not, he's a staunch atheist, right? And he's just recently gotten into McGowan. He's a big Lacanian, voracious reader. He's writing a book right now. He's a really, really good guy, but he's really steeped in McGowan right now. He posted a video. I'm like, dude, I'm about to have a chat with this young man this Saturday, right? He's really into McGowan. So I thought that was just the weirdest thing. It's totally not related at all to any of this stuff that we do. He posted that video. So I think it's a testament to how great that discussion was with McGowan. I think just getting into, his main thrust of that book. What's the book called? Hegel and?
It's called Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution. So I really like the book. I think that the book is basically and I don't want to be an insult to McGowan, like he is an original thinker in his own right, but he is very much indebted to Žižek, and I would say he says a lot of what Žižek says, just in less jargony terms, in more clearly, more systematically. And Todd has been one of these people who have been really open about not using jargon excessively, at least, and trying to present clear ideas. So I really respect him for that. Now, the idea of the book is essentially that the essence of Hegel's thought is contradiction, and that contradiction is inevitable, and most importantly, every identity contains its own inner contradiction. And I asked McGowan, is this any different from Žižek saying that every identity contains negativity? And he said, I don't know. He doesn't know, but he says he doesn't think so. So it's very similar to Žižek. To give like a concrete example, like just the concept of A, to have the concept of A internal to A itself, there must be not B, right? Or not A. And that's the only way A can have its identity. So that essentially means that B is internal to A. So his point is that there is an identity of identity and difference, which means that essentially you can't make a strict distinction between identity and difference, and this is contradiction. And contradiction isn't just a problem in our mind for him. Contradiction is a really an actually living thing, which gives us freedom, which allows for movement, which gives life to the world, really. So his whole ontology is about the contradictory nature of every identity, and how absolute knowing, how we can't escape this cycle, or whatever you want to call it, of contradiction. We can't escape the reality of contradiction, but we can reconcile ourselves with it and recognize that it is necessary and that we ourselves are contradictory. And I'll let you go now.
Let's that was abstract. I think that was poignant, but let's concretize it a bit.
Sure.
Right, what's Hegel doing? Hegel, is writing his philosophy, his phenomenology. Right, he's trying to give an account of how the world was created, how history moves forward, and he's an eschatological thinker in terms of he puts his theory towards the end of history, which is this realization of the absolute. So he's telling you how the world how the world in terms of history and science comes about through this process of forces, these relationship between forces in material, in the ideal realm, right? But we always end up talking about kind of this, let's take it from a materialist perspective. Mm-hmm. So matter engages with itself through specific forces. Two main forces are the thesis and the antithesis, right? This force that posits itself, right? And then it's a response or a negating of that force, right? Which then gives, it culminates into a synthesis, which some would say is a higher order level of understanding, right? So you have a relationship with someone, you have a point that you're trying to argue, and that person argues back with some points that you didn't think of, and you guys come to some conclusion that is new, that is derived from both of your points, your engagement, right? That's just the from a conversational perspective, but this maps at every level of being and every level of reality, from the physical, particles, cells, right? It's this interaction between every level of reality that presents this synthesis, right? And I think McGowan was saying that, it's not the contradiction does not resolve the tension between the thesis and the antithesis. It actually deepens the contradiction, right? Mm. So, and this made me think of sort of the apocalypse of Hegel's work, right? The apocalypse being the revealing. So this contradiction that's deepening is revealing more of the antinomies that are inherent in life. So this continued contradiction is simultaneously revealing that inherently reality itself is this contradiction. This incomplete reality itself is incomplete. It's not all, as Žižek likes to explain. It's hard to see. I try to concretize, and I just brought it right back to the abstract. So help me bring that more into concrete terms.
Well, first of all, maybe just to clarify that when we're talking about thesis and antithesis, for McGowan, the antithesis isn't opposed outside to the thesis like an enemy, and that's why he rejects the politics of an enemy, which is why he's a leftist. But for him, the thesis generates its own contradiction. It generates its own negation, which is why reality is in itself contradictory, because every identity contradicts itself. Now, to make it concrete, what this would mean in terms of reality being non-all, I think a good example to use actually is 666, because it is a complete, it is not complete. It is a totality which tries to account for everything within it. So let's take a concrete example of I don't want to use any modern political examples really, but just in case people are offended by that. But let's just say the beast, the final antichrist, the system of the antichrist. This political system will present itself as the totality, which there can be no opposition to it. But I mean, the problem is that any system which is and I'm going to try not to be too abstract here, but any system which tries to totalize itself from inside can't do so. And that's because to know something is whole, right? So let's just say this is reality, or this is a system, whatever you want. The limits are here, right? But to know these limits, you have to be outside of them. But from within the system, from within reality, you can't step outside of reality and look at it as a whole. This is something that we would say only God can do. And of course, this is why God, the seventh day of rest in the book of Genesis is so important, because we have creation on the sixth day. It's fully complete, right? But we still need that seventh day in which God looks upon his creation, blesses it, and totalizes it, completes it as a consistent whole. But for McGowan, for Žižek, and for Lacan, Hegel, all of these thinkers, they don't have a concept of God. And Lacan would call this perspective from outside. He calls this the big other, right? And the big other is essentially the gaze, which would totalize reality, make it a fully consistent, harmonious whole. But the point of all of these thinkers and why they're important for us and say many useful things, and in their context, true things from within, if you don't have this idea of the transcendent, if we're always already stuck within a certain horizon, whether that be our own subjectivity or history itself, our own position within history, because we're stuck inside, we're stuck within, we can't ever come to the conclusion that reality is whole and consistent. And for McGowan, the only way you can do that, the only way you could ever see yourself as being a stable, consistent entity is by creating an imaginary enemy in opposition to us. So the example he would use, I guess a more concrete example would be that of the Nazis. Žižek talks about this a lot as well. According to them, the Nazis themselves had an internal contradiction. And that contradiction was the fact that, they would say the economic tensions of the Third Reich, their society. And because they had all of these tensions and they had all of these problems, there was no unified German identity. That is an illusion to them. In order to have this idea of a German identity, they needed to create an enemy as the Jew. And the Jew, only in opposition to the Jew, could they create this imaginary idea of themselves as a stable identity. And so the Jew, in this sense, acts as an outside of, so the outside doesn't necessarily have to be a transcendent God. It can just be an enemy. It's just something outside of us which we don't identify with, we don't see ourselves in, and we don't see where we and in this way, we can see ourselves as not possessing contradiction and not being inherently, not having our own identities inherently negate ourselves. So just to summarize, the ontology of McGowan and Žižek and these guys is that reality, because there is no big other, there's no way to abstract ourselves out and constitute reality as whole, we're always incomplete. We're always unable to constitute ourselves as stable, consistent, harmonious identities. So contradiction is irreducible, inevitable for them.
Yeah, which seems to be like the fundamental axiom there, right? And they make
for McGowan especially.
Yeah, the distinctions that there really is no transcendent, but there's this imaginary space where we can go outside ourselves and make this friend-enemy distinction. I think it's using a sense of the transcendent, right? But it's not applying it to any kind of ultimate transcendence. So there is no big other. There is no God in a sense, and there is no God in a sense of early on in Adam and Eve, right? We maybe we'll get into this. The fall happened because the serpent came to Adam and Eve and said, "Eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you become like God." So we're constantly attempting to become like God. We're attempting to access the big other, and it's not there because that was a fantasy. That was a fiction that inaugurated the fall, right? So I think they're right in their positing of how history and materialism has led to this point of continuously trying to step outside yourself to complete yourself, and you just can't do that in the constellation of effects in this world that we have. I think they're right about that, right? So I think but when you bring in the kind of orthodox patristic understanding of the deep roots of what that means in terms of the fall and what God is in terms of the dichotomy between God's essence and his energies, we can never experience God's essence, but we can engage with his energies, right? And I think that is something to be mined for theoretical fruits down the road. So this leads me to the idea. So what, and I think we talked about Schmitt earlier, and I'm reading him now. He has this book called Political Theology, and I've been thinking to myself, everything's become politicized, and I'm like, what is this politicized? What does that mean, right? And Schmitt says that the political is that which establishes the friend-enemy distinction, not just on an individual level, but also a collective level. So I and you, or we, us and them, right? And the political decision is that which instantiates the friend-enemy distinction in a sense. So, going back to the Nazis, right? That decisive moment of considering the Nazis other, right? Considering the enemy is the kind of political political decision that is made. And he also says that to be sovereignty is that which determines the state of exception. Right? Sovereign is that which determines the state of exception. So in an example, think about the coronavirus, and this is something I've been thinking of, right? The coronavirus is the exception that makes us give up some of our rights, right? And then that which is sovereign is shown to respond to the exception, right? So I think there's something interesting there to correlate there, right? Of the friend-enemy distinction in the political sense, and then that which makes the exception, which to make an exception, right, is to stand outside the system. That you have a legal framework in order to posit there's an exception that causes for emergency orders that you step outside the framework, you're stepping into this contradictory space, right? And that he who makes that decision, or the entity that makes that decision, is said to be sovereign. So, it's what's sovereign is not, democracy or the Congress or the president, right? You have to observe and see what is it that makes that in a time of an emergency, saying this is an exception and it's an emergency. We need to circumvent our legal and normative ways of going about things. Right. So I think we'll just kind of leave that there. And going back to this, let's dig in a little bit of this understanding that you can't step outside of yourself. I think the idea that 666 is the root cause of totalitarianism. Right? It's inherent in the language there, a totalizing system which tries to account for the remainder. It tries to account for the exception. Right. It causes, I think that's what causes this internal contradiction that leads to the destruction of the system as such, right? So, yeah, I forgot kind of where I was going with that.
Well, I can comment on that.
Yeah, please.
Because it just kind of just came to me. It's like, as you were saying, it's like the contradiction is that it tries to totalize, and it tries to, and because of this, because of the fact that it isn't a totality, it isn't a true totality, it has to act totalitarian. So I mentioned this at the end of the 666 video I made, the existence of the saints, their very existence disproves the beast, the fact that it isn't a true totality. And because of this, because the saints are that exception that stand outside of the system, and just by existing, are signifying that this system is incomplete. It's not all. The beast has to attack. It has to try and subsume these others into itself. And just like I think the idea of salvation and stuff, like in The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis talk. I have a very vague memory of it, but there's this guy who is essentially obsessed with himself, and that is essentially hell for Lewis. It's this sort of like a solipsistic state, and we have like this angel or saint or whatever come down, trying to bring this guy outside of himself and to bring him in and to make him look away from himself, his own desires, his own cares, and towards God. But you have to give up your sense of totality. You have to give up your sense of completeness in order to do this. And not the paradox, but the mystery is that you only truly become this totality. You only become complete when you are recognize that you are incomplete. And then this recognition opens up the space for God's energies to make you complete, to make you who you are, to actualize your potentials as a human being, and as a creature. And that's really what I would say. It's that we're sort of in agreement with McGowan and Žižek that we need to reconcile ourselves with our own contradiction. But this also just came to me. If you've read St. Gregory Palamas's discourse and debates with Barlaam, Barlaam was sort of saying what Žižek and McGowan was saying, that, well, we just need to empty ourselves and go into this darkness. And for Barlaam, that was just the end. But for Palamas, that was just the beginning. Yes, we have to. He talks about this in the Triads. We have to get rid of all finite, thoughts, imaginations. But this is just emptying ourselves for the Holy Spirit to enter into us. But of course, for Barlaam, this emptying was just the end. This was this was the goal of spirituality for him. And that would be analogous to the era of Žižek and McGowan, where we're just reconciling ourselves with contradiction, and then that's it.
With
But
the
for us,
void, right? With
right,
negativity, with the void. Yeah, that's where it stops. And that's how you're going to build up your identity and your subjectivity from the void, right?
mm-hmm.
I think that's, I mean to cut you off there. I think that's a great way to frame it. And I think, this giving up of oneself, is the idea of the sacrifice Christ made, right? Is sacrificing yourself. I think, in the scriptures, it says to get your life, you must lose it, right? In order to get life, you must lose your life, in a sense. And I think it's interesting to think of the monasteries when you have a system like Nazism, or you have, a totalitarian system. They need to get rid of the churches, and they attack the monasteries because very practically a monastery sits outside of the world. They're not involved with the world. This totalizing force, these machinations, they sit outside and pray, in a sense, right? So that's why the beast would have to attack the monastics and the saints, right, in order to affect this totalizing force. And also what came up with me is this idea of fractal totalitarianism, right? This thing that we're talking about, this beast, is not just a political entity, it's a personal entity, right? You can think of a tyrannical father that rules with an iron fist, right? His specific understanding of the rules of life are what are inculcated in the family. And if anybody goes out of this totalitarian framework, right, they must be brought in or destroyed, and then that's where the friend enemy distinction is made, right, by the sovereign, the father who names the state of exception. But that's fractal at every level of reality, and we can intuit it. That's why when we saw what's happened in the States and across the globe with the exception that is the coronavirus and those measures, right, this turnkey totalitarianism, as it's been called, is being affected on the people, right? Where you cannot have any disagreement, whatever it is, whether it's vaccines, whether it's masks, whatever it is. It's not that you disagree with my position, we need to discuss it, we agree to disagree. It's you cannot have that position. You cannot even express that position. So that is essentially totalitarianism that we've seen. So I think it's important to work out these kind of ideas as we're kind of living through it right now, right? And then, what is it that drives the totalitarian impulse? I think it's something like what Lacan calls small object A, or the object cause of desire, right? Because the thing that you think is the cause of your desire is that which you will be attempting to obtain. And any time you obtain this object cause of desire, it disappears and another object appears, in a sense. So small object A, like we discussed before, I think McGowan calls it in terms of non-jargony, an obstacle and impetus. Mm-hmm. I think it's the stumbling block, right? Yeah. It's the passions, in a sense. It's that which drives your neurosis and your narcissism, right? That keeps you neurotic and narcissistic, right? That's continuously attempting to obtain the apple, right, of the knowledge of good and evil. And right when you obtain it, it disappears. It goes right through your fingers, and then you do it again and again. So there's this constant fractal, endeavor to get that knowledge of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is trying to complete oneself, is trying to obtain one's identity and subjectivity in a totalizing fashion, yeah. Right? Which humanity has this impetus for a reason, right? And that was ultimately man's dispensation was theosis, was to become like God in his energies. The fall happened was when the fall into sin and the fall into multiplicity was the idea that man is to become God in his energy, in his essence, to be the ultimate totalitarian or the ultimate totalizing force within one's identity, within one's family, within one's nation, within the world, right? Yeah. So I think maybe we can dig in a bit to what happened in terms of what we just discussed here from an orthodox perspective in the fall of Adam and Eve, right? So Adam means humanity. It means this individual Adam. We got to always think of it fractally. So the individual Adam and humanity as a whole, and in Eve, the term means life. So the individual life and life as a whole, right? So the idea is that Adam and Eve were to eventually eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? I think this is lost in most contemporary Christianity, right? That tree was supposed to be, and the one commandment, the prohibition, right, was do not eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But that tree had to be put there, right? Because Adam and Eve were growing spiritually and walking with God and continually to grow spiritually. So what would it have looked like if they would have grew? They would have kept the commandment, eaten from the tree of life, right? And then eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think that would mean that we had appropriate relationship with Christ, with God, with the infinite. And in building civilization and in building identities, right, then we would be able to build them appropriately. Right. And I don't think it's in a utopian sense, but, well-being would flourish if that was what happened prior to prior to the fall. So I think all of these thinkers are tarrying with the results of the fall ultimately. So yeah, I'll let you go from there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I like that you mentioned the example of the tyrannical father, because Žižek actually talks about it in his point. And I think Lacan, he gets it from Lacan, that the tyrannical father, when he has this outburst of anger, right, he actualizes his potentials as tyrannical. This is the paradoxical moment when he reveals his own impotence. He reveals his lack of control, and it's like, okay, this is it, because mostly the threat functions most powerfully when it isn't actualized. And this goes into more Lacanian, the big other and stuff. When it reveals itself, when the beast plays its when the tyrannical father has this outburst of anger, he's now undermined himself in the sense that, well, he's no longer this mysterious authority. He is right there, and we can deal with what's right there, right? And that's why I think, so I will come back. That was I know we have to talk about the fall, but Seraphim Hamilton has talked about how increasingly we have all these evildoers that are becoming exposed for who they are. Jeffrey Epstein, Ellen, all of these people, Harvey Weinstein, all of these people are behind the scenes, but they're being shown for who they are. And I think as we come closer and closer to the end of this cycle of civilization, if you want to, perhaps you think it's the end of the world, whatever, what's going to happen is that the line between the beast and the saints is going to be revealed. But in that way, that will be our opportunity to see them for what they are. And it will no longer be like we speak of they that are manipulating behind the scenes. Well, when the time comes, we will know who they are, because that's what the Antichrist is. The Antichrist needs that glorification, needs to be known. And yeah, so I just thought that was interesting. And the fall.
So this came up real quick. I'll place it in here. So the contradiction is revelatory. The contradiction is revelatory. Another great example of this is the contradiction between the measures put in response to the coronavirus, right, and the actual facts and the results that came from the outcome of those measures. Whether it was lockdown, there was a report, a pretty exhaustive report from one of the most prestigious journals that said lockdowns did not help very, very little, if at all, and caused all of these second and third order effects that were disastrous. They're looking to double down on those measures. You see what's happening in China, where Shanghai has been in lockdown for 2 weeks. So that's a contradiction, and it reveals where the totalitarian impetus is in the system, right? China is hyper totalitarianistic, right? But we've seen that bleed over into the West with the measures that were taken. And I think it's important that we can observe what happens, and in this contradiction is revealed to reality, where the beast is operating, right? And it made me think of Heidegger's distinction between ontic and ontological, right? Ontological is kind of the behind the scenes machinations of life in itself, right? So when you're using a pen to write a story, you're not observing the pen, you're not thinking about the pen, right? So it's an ontological endeavor, right? But when that pen breaks and you can no longer use it, you look at the pen, right? Because it's that contradiction now. Right. I was trying to write and now I can't write anymore. What's going on? What's wrong? I can see and observe the pen. I think it's the same thing that's happening with this revelation of contradiction that we're seeing kind of everywhere. And then let me read this little section here so I can get your input here on this understanding of the fall. This is from the book Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Eastern Orthodox Christian Anthropology and Dialogue. And there's a quote by Yanaris here that gives this dichotomy between Adam and Eve's choice right at the fall, right? What was their choice and what did they decide to do? So it says, in Yanaris, this is from 2012, reading of the early chapters of Genesis, he viewed Adam and Eve, or humanity, as Yanaris read the narrative, as an iconographical depiction of humanity as facing two choices, or, quote, two existential possibilities, that life should be one, that life should be realized as relation, self-transcendence, and self-offering kenosis, bringing with it knowledge of the potentialities of existence as faith, trust exercised in communion, or that the knowledge should be sought as an individually possessed certainty, and life as a finite but individually managed existential event. And I think that all of these 20th century psychoanalytic thinkers and 21st century are grappling with that second choice that was made, right? And the answer is, to me, is this self-offering, this kenosis, which brings with it the knowledge of the potentialities of existence as faith. It reminds me of this Deleuzean understanding of line of flight, of creating, Deleuze's ultimate, project is novelty, right? Is the new, so when we're thinking about the understanding of what Adam and Eve, what their dispensation was ultimately going to be, there's this tendency to think it's boring. It's, it just turns into, first century thinking and understanding of how humans organize their lives, right? But ultimately, the technology, which is looked at as this very disintegrating force, if it's appropriately apprehended and used and leveraged in society, the New Jerusalem will be a technical society, right? Mm-hmm. So all this technology that is, when it comes, this new technology, AI, as it comes to us, it's very fear-inducing because we've seen the results of social media and Facebook, what it's done to people and what's pulled out of people. But ultimately, this understanding that Yanaris puts here, this first understanding, would even put technology in its appropriate place in the hierarchy in terms of a well-functioning, healthy human civilization. So yeah, that kind of inaugurate that distinction there.
Yeah, I think the technology is a good way to, get into this and approach the question because, well, for one, I mean, the idea that modern technology, like, I think it's a very simplistic idea to say that the goal of man with technology now is we just want to like we're just these Cartesian subjects who want to master and dominate the world. And like to a certain extent, yeah, that's true. But at the same time, look at the technology we're creating now. This technology that we're creating, we have no control of. And like, isn't the goal of modern technology a self-reproducing system? So a system where we don't have to be involved in. So we are essentially we are creating all of this AI and all this stuff that you mentioned that it's like we're not going to have control over. And it's like, and we know this, and that is largely what we're trying to do. And that's why a proper use of technology would be us having understanding that this is our creation, that we should be using for the glorification of creation, and we can use technology for our own purposes. But really, the big issue today is that we don't have technology under control, and we are allowing technology to control us. And even if we have this illusion that we are the ones in control, we're largely out of control, and we're losing control more and more because like I don't even believe there's anyone at the top who even has control over where industrial society goes. I mean, maybe if you got literally all of the elites, all of the richest people in control, if they all came together and worked together, we could change what's going on. But there is no one person up there who has control over the techno-industrial system right now. But ideally, man acting as a unity, as a whole in a proper hierarchy, we would be able to control and use technology properly. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, or if you'd like me to talk a little more about the fall.
I think we are talking about the fall here, so I think that was good. I think that something that kind of came to me there was this contradiction that we've been talking about, right? In terms of this technological progress that we cannot control, but we have the illusion of control, was what is the manifestation of the beast. And it is a manifestation of what the serpent promised Adam and Eve. If they ate from the knowledge of good and evil, that they would become like God, right? So they would become the illusion. I think this is the inaugurates subjectivity of self-consciousness as such, as we are these self-enclosed, independent, individualistic identities. And in doing so, right, I think technology, thinking from an Enochian perspective, like technology is something, Heidegger says the essence of technology is nothing technological. Technology is an entity, right? Or many entities, right? And it uses human beings' free will in order to build its body, right? What if you think of it as kind of AI essentially, and it's this calculative, inframing gestalt form of the world as a resource to be mined. And ultimately to build the body, not our body, but the body of the beast. So the beast is building its body through human consciousness in the appropriation of technical skills in order to manifest itself. And the fact that doesn't sound crazy because of what's happening now is crazy. The fact that doesn't sound absurd or some kind of theoretical thing, it seems rather hyper obvious at this point. And the problem that we find ourselves in is I don't see a way of of walking anything back. There's a phenomenon with nuclear energy, right? We started building nuclear weapons. And once you have multiple nations building nuclear weapons, once we realize that we're going to destroy ourselves collectively as a race, like America can't stop building nuclear weapons, because then the idea, this game theoretic idea that China will overcome them technologically. So we got to keep building. And then this constant building of these technologies, which are ultimately destructive to humanity, it starts this process of continuously building. So same thing with artificial intelligence, right? You have China leading the way with AI. We can't say, oh, this AI can be very dangerous in a very existential sense. Let's stop doing it, right? They tried with nuclear proliferation treaties or whatnot, but with AI, it's just a race to the bottom. It's a race to the subjugation of humanity. So we got to get back to the dignity of a human being. And I think that's why this is important, to articulate a potential patristic response to 20th century understandings of subjectivity. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, maybe we can bring in this section here. So Alexander Dugin is a political philosopher, geopolitician, and he had this notion, and I think I'm going to try to present it here, that the ultimate conclusion, the ultimate consequence of materialism, of scientism, is object-oriented ontology, right? Because so we go from understanding the world in terms of our subjectivity, correlationism, the way we think about being and how being interacts in the world, and we're always talking about how things show up for us phenomenologically as human beings. Whereas in the object-oriented ontology, it's not subject-oriented ontology. It's not human, or what potentially a human person is, oriented ontology. It's the ontology of things in themselves. It's the ontology. So it just effaces the human completely, right? And that's a logical conclusion of this fall into multiplicity, because now we're investing our desire, we're investing being in the objects in themselves and cutting us off. And obviously Dugin, who's an Orthodox Christian, that's for another time. He says that he appreciates like Harman and Negrosante and these object-oriented ontologists, because they're saying what they're doing. They're not pretending to do, so it's the ultimate manifestation of the beast philosophically is object-oriented ontology, according to this line of reasoning. Wonder what you would think on that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I haven't really read Dugin that much, but I can see how Heidegger would influence him there, like in the sense that how Being in Time, chapter 4, the concept of the they, and how Dasein loses itself. And we aren't ourselves. And in the sense of when we're obsessed with this realm of objects, we lose ourselves. Dasein loses itself in objects. I guess like I would agree with that on a political level, but I would also want to emphasize and stick to because I would say, like, in Christian terms, I like to understand the fall and the way subjectivity and our interactions in the world work as pride and idolatry. And they're very much interconnected. But I would say that this obsession with objects would fall on the side of idolatry. And then I would say I would hold to a Žižekian idea, a critique of Heidegger. For Žižek, it's a critique of Heidegger, that we still, even though we lose ourselves in the objects, there still is this fundamental pridefulness, and there is the singularity of the subject and subjectivity that we can't get rid of. And ultimately, even when we're obsessed with all of these objects, this subject remains. And I think one of the best books Žižek ever wrote actually was Hegel and a Wired Brain. I covered on my YouTube channel, where he actually shows how in the wired brain, when we lose all of our mastery and control over objects, and when we even lose control over our own thoughts, because that's what the wired brain does, we lose our thoughts into the collective hive mind, we will still remain as the void, as ourselves. And of course, not of course, but in my video on 666, I tried to talk about how my thesis is that this subject without content, without mastery, who is nothing more than its own self-relating void, that is hell. And that is hell fully actualized. It's that. And I would say this is what C.S. Lewis says in The Great Divorce. And funny enough, actually, when we were making our video on Žižek and Orthodoxy, my cousin just happened to open J. Dyer's Discord and we're not like on Discord a lot. And he just opened it, and Seraphim Hamilton just happened to be talking about hell, and he just happened to use the words less than nothing The title of Žižek's most famous book, how he describes the void, how he describes the subject as less than nothing. He just happened to use that term, and he's never read Žižek. He happened to use that term to describe hell. And literally, as we were making the video, this big coincidence happened where we happened to find this quote. So I'm like, I have to include this in the video. So yeah, I would agree that with Dugin and Heidegger, that in this system and in a practical political sense, economic sense, we're and in our everyday activities, we're losing ourselves in these objects, and we are have this idolatrous relationship with objects. But at the same time, I would hold that pride precedes idolatry. And even to have this world of objects, we need to have ourselves, right, who are the ones looking at these objects. And there is this absolute singularity of the subject that persists nonetheless. And it's this subject that I'm, not because the object side isn't important, it's just, for me, the subject side is the most important and the most neglected amongst, I would say, modern Orthodox Christian, even just right-wing conservative interpretations of philosophy. I would say like Lacan, Žižek, McGowan, these guys remain largely untouched, while there have been many books written on Heidegger from a Orthodox perspective, and only one on Lacan, it seems. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Well said. And that last part where you talked about, hell being this experience, it made me think the phenomenology of hell, the experience of hell, is what, this idea of less than nothing. And this idea is the subject qua void, this self-negating negation, right? It made, this kind of flashed in my mind, is that ultimately the subject will be colonized by machines, by the machine world, and will be there, this empty void as a catatonic state, right? As this technology completely colonizes, our human consciousness and human subjectivity. I don't think that that's the case, and I think that that's a kind of a scary thing to think. They're going to be in this state where, you are getting surgery done on you, right? And you're out, but you're still awake. You can't say anything or do anything. That's tremendously horrible. So, but I think a lot of this idea of pride and idolatry is important, and I think that pride is the most important, right? Because it's what inaugurates the impetus to identify yourself with your self-identification. It identifies this self-negating negation that is the void of subjectivity. It happens from pride because you don't need anybody else. You don't need another, right? It's done, unconsciously through this self-positing that is ultimately a contradiction that is a void, in a sense. So we're trying to attach ourselves to the void. We're trying to attach ourselves to this notion of subjectivity. And I think ideology is very related, I think, to object A, right? Object A is these little fractal these fractal idols that we make, whether it's sex or a relationship or status or money or the house or drugs, whatever it may be. We idealize, we make an idol out of it, right? And through our pride, we try to obtain that which we idol. We try to commune with these instances of our idols, and in doing so, practically, it always leads to destruction, neurosis, depression, things of that nature. I wouldn't say, I don't know about always, but that seems to be kind of the case. So maybe we could, I think we said a lot there. I don't know if you wanted to pivot a bit to, you and McGowan had a great exchange on love, right? Maybe we should bring it to love here, right? As the kind of this force that is the exception in terms of the contradiction. It's just the way it kind of came to me.
Can I say one more thing about hell? Something that just occurred to me right now, in terms of subjectivity and stuff. And then we can stop there. But I've been sort of thinking what it means for hell to be eternal and for heaven to be eternal, and in the sense, I've been trying to really think through the idea that heaven and hell aren't symmetrical. Like hell isn't just the opposite of heaven, because less than nothing isn't just the opposite of something, because nothing is opposite of something, right? In the same way that sin isn't the opposite of goodness, there isn't a symmetry there. Sin is just a deprivation of goodness. And it's like, I was trying to think about, what does it mean for hell to be eternal? And I was thinking about, and I'm like, well, what do the fathers say about time in this sense? And in the Confessions, St. Augustine talks about the present moment. And he talks about how it has no length. Like, you know, how there's the future and then there's the past, and then the present is always self-annihilating. Like, we can never grasp the present. And for that reason, it has no length. And for the way I kind of understand this, the fact that all content that we have has to exist across time, like to think a thought, it has to, you're involving past, present, and future in this flow of time. So the way I like to think about this is that heaven is when past and future and present all become, we all lead up to this final state where it's all enveloped and accounted for. But hell would be analogous to the present, where it is just as eternal, because the present moment, it's an eternity that is the opposite of a heavenly eternity, if you get what I mean. It's like, it's like it has no length, but because like Wittgenstein has talked about how, like, you have eternal life if you live in the present, right? If you live in the moment, you have eternal life, because from within the moment, it is quote unquote eternal. But I would say that because it only becomes non-eternal when you pass into the present and when you pass into the future. That's its negation. But I would say that hell is sort of a present moment that is literally yourself, devoid of all substantial content, because I'm trying to work out, this was a little confusing. I'm just trying to figure it out, that the present moment literally has the same structure as the void of the subject. Because you know how we talk about how the subject as the void has no content, right? It has no personality. It is just this void. But the present moment without the past and future, and this relates to stuff Byung-Chul Han's talked about in The Sense of Time, how it's only when the past and present, they commune, essentially, present, past, and future commune, that we build this meaningful sense of time and don't just have individual points. But I would say that hell is this point of the present and of subjectivity, where it's eternal because you can't ever escape it, and you've turned away from the past and the present and eternity itself. You've turned away from eternity, and it's this turning away into yourself, into the present moment, that is hell, essentially. And like in the same way that Satan, there's this idea that man was going to rule over the angels, but Satan didn't want that, so he held on to this present moment. He held on to his temporal state. And in the same way, present man in his fallen state, hell is essentially holding on to the fall, refusing God's grace. And in this sense, it is analogous to the present moment. So I would say that the present moment there, I just wanted to draw a connection here between heaven, hell, eternity, the present moment, subjectivity, and the substantial human. That the substantial human is like hell, like I just wanted to, like, this idea of not being symmetrical. Like, I'll just go through all three and then conclude. Like, eternity of heaven and eternity of hell, they're not the same experiences of eternity. One is an eternity of the present, and one is an eternity of an infinity of God. Then there's the idea of fallen. There's man in hell who is the subject in hell is empty, and it is still man, quote unquote, but it's lost everything that is human about it. So versus us in heaven, where we are fully actualized, we're more than ourselves, or we are fully ourselves. And then in hell, we are completely lost even to ourselves, and it's through this obsession with ourselves that we are lost. So that was a little longer than I expected it to be, but essentially just I wanted to draw those connections there. And yeah.
That was it's kind of uncanny. I was just reading this concept, this insight that you came up with. Dugan just wrote about it almost precisely like you just constructed it. So I'm going to try to find it really quick and read this section real quick, because that was phenomenal. So
okay.
All right. So I wanted to bring up this section, and I don't know if this is exactly where I want to be. So I'm going to start reading a little bit to see if it kind of makes sense. So in the beginning here of this chapter 10 from the Fourth Political Theory, Alexander Dugin, it's entitled The Ontology of the Future. And he brings in Heidegger a lot. He's a Heideggerian. He's written dozens of books on Heidegger. And he talks about, Heidegger's three ontologies, three ecstasies of time. And then he talks about time in terms of music. And he brings in Husserl. And then here's where he starts talking about the past, the present, and the future. He says, the future should therefore be understood in this context. The future is continuous in the present, not the moment of novum, which means the new thing, but the process of the fading of the present into the past. The future is the tail end of the present, its resonance. We live the future just now and already now when we play the note of the melody of life. The future is the process of the death of the present, attention to the dissolution of melody into the totality of harmony. The new appears in the future only when the harmony is lost, when our attention falls asleep, and then suddenly we awaken and cannot identify the sounds that we hear. And he says later here, he talks about the short circuit. Let me see if I can get into this here. He says Edmund Husserl says, it is the nature of discrete, discontinuous events, talking about the ecstasy of time. It is the suspended moment of being without history, and hence without a sense of awareness and consciousness. Edmund Husserl dug much deeper into phenomenology of time. He discovered the new instance of consciousness lying underneath the level where the nature of time as illuminated by music is perceived. According to Husserl, beneath this level, there is another ultimate one, which is responsible, and this made me think of the eternity here, which is responsible for our perception of what is now with the force of evidence and a much more intensive taste of reality that recalls the ever-dying past. This instance is consciousness itself, the consciousness as such that precedes the intentionality and the dualist nature of apprehension, being necessarily divided into two parts, the perceived and the perceiving. In the present, the consciousness perceives itself and nothing else. That is the ultimate experience of the last source of reality. According to Husserl, the foundation of all consciousness is transcendental subjectivity, from whence it conceives itself as a kind of short circuit. This experience is self-referential. In it, there is the perception of pure being as the presence of the subjectivity of consciousness. This short circuit causes all kinds of dualities to be born, the logical ones and the temporal ones. The necessity of stopping this trauma is manifest in the creation of time, the articulation of the three moments of time. Consciousness of time is necessary to hide the present, which is the traumatic experience of the self-referential nature of pure consciousness. So again, consciousness of time is necessary to hide the present, which is the traumatic experience of the self-referential nature of pure consciousness. Intentionality and logical judgments are all rooted in this evasion of the perception of the pain of the void, whereby consciousness becomes aware of itself. Such an attitude to the levels of consciousness explains the origin of time as the evasion of the present and the unbearable tension of the pure presence of the same. And he goes on and on. And he says,
what book is this? Sorry.
That is the Fourth Political Theory, Alexander Dugin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he goes on and on. So Dugin talks about, he's really looking the ultimate political solution to, his fourth political theory. So there's the first three political theories: liberalism, communism, and fascism. He's saying we need to do away with these categories. Liberalism has become this unipolarity where it's the only operating force, and it's degenerated into some hyper neoliberalism in a sense. And his answer to that is Heideggerian, is Dasein. He says the future is Dasein, right? And Dasein is that which exists, prior to the subject-object divide and split. So he's somehow trying to get back, to what, Heraclitus was asking when he was considering the question of philosophy, or the pre-Socratics and the Socratics. He said that, there was the beginning of philosophy degenerated into Gestalt, right? Degenerated into calculative thinking. What were the questions that were being asked at the beginning of philosophy to inaugurate a new beginning? And that this inauguration happens through Dasein, right? Which is a more originary, primordial understanding of being in itself rather than beings, right? Is getting back to a more originary sense of being as such. And he says that, Heidegger says that being has turned away from beings, and that there's just this big gulf between being in itself and being as such. But sorry to go on a tangent there, but I was just reading that and you brought up this kind of original insight. So that was good.
That's exactly really what I was trying to say. And it's funny actually that I was reading Žižek's Absolute Recoil, and he says that the subject can't be present. And it's like, he doesn't really Žižek doesn't ever have any, he doesn't have any good takes on time, I would say. And he doesn't really deal with this question of time to at least in a way that's interesting to me. And I would say the complete opposite. I would agree with Dugin that the subject, it's the void. It isn't outside of time. It is the present. The subject is, because as Augustine says, this is a direct quote from the Confessions. He says, the present has no space. So what he means by this is that the present literally is just a self-annihilating moment. It is the, to quote Lewis in the Screwtape Letters, it's the slice of eternity. It's just this point. And to me, the subject is this point of it like, I don't want to say that the subject is identical with the present moment, but I'm still trying to work it out. There is this exact homology between the structure of subjectivity and how it needs all of this content to become the human, and the structure of to become a full personality. But at the same time, even as the void, it is this minimal level of personality. And at the same time, the present moment, it is this minimal level of time, or the minimal slice of eternity, right? But it needs the past and future to envelop it to in order to become eternity. So I don't really know I don't really know how to deal with this. I just know that I just have a feeling that in order to get past some of the stuff Žižek says that just isn't compatible with orthodoxy, I would say that the part, what he misses with subjectivity, is the crucial dimension of time, and how essentially a subject without content, completely devoid of content, just as the void, is this pure present moment, which of course Dugan identifies with the void. And that is, to me, that is hell. That is an eternity that is the direct opposite of the eternity of hell, but not a symmetrical opposite, an asymmetrical opposite, which is why hell is eternal, but it is an eternity of contentless, solipsistic confusion.
Yeah, well said. And Dugan says elsewhere, he says time is man's ultimate identity, in a sense, right? So we're at time here, but you want to, let's maybe you have 5-10 more minutes. Let's try to
talk about love.
Yeah, let's elucidate.
Sure.
Let's talk about love. In terms of McGowan, your discussion with him, I think it was important. And then let's end with, what is a speculative, or not speculative, what is an understanding of the subject from an Orthodox perspective?
That's the question, right? Well, okay, to talk about love,
I think they're related. That's why I brought them together.
Okay. Yeah. Well, love for McGowan, love for McGowan is a contradiction, right? And it involves the self, which you need to love. You put more value in the other than your own self, right? And this is for him a literal contradiction. Like, as he said to me, it's a literal contradiction where you are trying to raise the other higher than yourself, but this activity is your doing. So you are like, it's like imagine someone trying to jump on their own shoulders. Like, it's an impossible act, but that is what we do when we love another. And when we with true love, that is. And I would say with the subject, well, I would say that what I would ask McGowan, and which I would ask Žižek as well, and why I brought up this idea of Žižek's, which I would say that McGowan he misses what Žižek gets, in the sense that for Žižek, I think Žižek would have an issue with saying that the subject can even perform this activity of raising the other higher than itself. I'm not sure, but I would say that follows from Žižek's logic, because I even got that metaphor of jumping on your own shoulders from Žižek, because the subject, as they conceptualize it, I just don't understand how this self-relating entity is able to perform an act of communion, which is essentially communion, where you reach outside of yourself. How can the subject do that? For Žižek, in Less Than Nothing, it can't. Like, absolute knowing for Žižek is simply reconciling yourself with the impossibility of escaping your self-relation. For McGowan, it's a little different, and I would say that it's different because I would just say, if I had to, my criticism, I guess, of McGowan, or a question I would pose to him is he really taking full account of what they call the subject? Because the subject is the self-relating negativity for him and Žižek. So how can the subject escape itself? I don't think they really have the space to conceptualize true love. And even if they're getting at something correct there, I just don't think the foundation they're starting on has the conceptual power to really account for it. And I would say, to bring this to the Orthodox Christian understanding of the subject, I would say that, and I would just want to preface this by saying that this is a lot of this has to do with my speculations, although I consciously try my best to be consistent with the Bible and the Church Fathers, I would say that at the center of every human being, deep in our own selves, is a void, and this void is original sin, whatever you want to call it. And we, in having this void in ourselves, it is both ourselves and not us, and that's because we are, while we can be sinful, that is not who we truly are, and that's not who we're supposed to be, and that's why sin is always confusion. And I would say that a true human being, for a hypostasis, what it truly is inherently an inherently communal being. So I would say that the person in Orthodox theology is this communal being who communes with others, loves God, and extends outside of itself, and is able to do so through the grace of God. So, and here's what I would say: how would we be able to think a subject which escapes itself and is able? Because you know how I said that from within earlier. I said from within you can't totalize reality, and the same thing with the subject. From within yourself, you can't totalize yourself. You can't jump on your own shoulders and see yourself just as an individual. But how can we actually do this? And I would say it's by leaving ourselves through the grace of God, entering into the infinity of God. And by entering into this infinity, we're able to see ourselves as finite. So I would say that the act of love, in the contradiction in love, this contradiction can only be made possible if there is this power of communion that we have inherently by the grace of God, and that it always involves a literal leaving of ourselves, but there has to be a medium through which this is done. And I would say this medium is the Holy Spirit, the energy, or the divine energies. And it's through this medium of the divine energies that we leave ourselves as a self-relating entity and commune with others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I think that sounds right. Right. And I think it goes to the very simplistic yet profound commandments to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. But those two things. But the task of modern man, modern fallen materialistic scientific 21st century man, to really love God with all their heart, not say they do, not, to actually have this ontological reorientation towards God, the God of love, the infinite, the Father through Christ, right? You need grace. There needs to be, it's a dialogical, reciprocal relationship between the infinite and the finite. But we've disclosed and cut ourselves off from the infinite, from the transcendent, right? And then even when we fall in love, when we say, oh, I fell in love, and the impossible happened of going outside yourself, we're so mired in this thinking, and so concerned and so hesitant to reorient ourselves towards God because of all the fraught issues with that. The Taliban orient themselves towards God. There's been so many misapprehensions or disasters that were caused by the saying that, I understand God myself. And again, I think the difference is there, my understanding of God versus relationship with God. If you have my understanding, the pride comes in again, you try to convert people and you start a religion, a denomination, right? So there's actual reorientation, and, sin is missing the mark. So to ameliorate sin is to reorient yourself appropriately to the infinite. So it's about mediating appropriately this finite and infinite relationship. All right. To do that is, one, to love God with all your heart, and two, to love your neighbor, which is the other, right? Instead of neighbor, let's think of it as other, to love the other as yourself. So you can't do the second part without the first part, because to love God with all your heart, to love the infinite, and it's about, using or appropriating God's love through you to the others, right? And in doing so, healing the rift that is at the core of this negativity, this subjectivity. And in doing so, you'll be kind of entering the kingdom of heaven, which is already at hand. So the energies are here for us to participate in, right? It's about wrestling. If you're going to wrestle with something, if you're going to be tarrying with a negative, right? Why don't you wrestle with this idea of love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And then ultimately there's a political solution, which is love your enemy, which doesn't mean that there's no distinction between you and someone else, or you and a group of other people, or a difference between a collective and another collective. But to love your enemy, right, it destroys, it short circuits the political aspect of it. And in a sense, you could have distinct collectives, right, interacting and being in the world together, right, with these simple rules: love God with all your heart, love,
Yes.
your neighbor as yourself, and love your enemies. And I guess lastly here, this, when you were talking before, McLuhan has this quote. He says, "Violence is the quest for identity." So he says, violence is a quest for identity. I'd say that violence is the quest for fallen identity.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And I would say, and violence is, if we want to understand this fallen identity as negativity, as a void of, I am myself because I am not you, and I don't see myself in you. And instead of communing with you, I withdraw from you. This is violence. I mean, this is how Hegel speaks of violence. Like, it's a violent act of severing yourself from others. And so, yeah, I would say that the distinction here is the violence of fallen identity, negativity, void, all of these terms you want to use. On the other hand, we have the love of true identity, and which is, instead of self-relating, there's the opposite notion of communion, and instead of violence, peace, etc.
Yeah. And I think that maybe part 2 will be how wrestling or apprehending or communing with the Trinity, the understanding of how the Trinity operates within itself, right? God is one, but it's also three. And in those the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I think can inform us how to relate with ourselves and each other and in communities. I think that's for another time. And maybe another time too, is this, maybe we won't go there. But I think we can leave it there. I think that was great.
Sure.
Anything else you want to add?
No, that's all. I've taken up enough of your time, and
no.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate your time. So thank you. Till next time. God bless.
God bless.